Welcome to the 10th episode in this series covering AQA's GCSE History Unit, America, Opportunity and Inequality. If you haven't seen the previous videos in the series, I'd recommend going to the #HisTV YouTube channel and watching those first, particularly episode 9 that covers the early civil rights movement in the 1950s and early 1960s. In today's video, we're going to cover the key question, how did the civil rights movement change in the 1960s, and focus on different voices in the Black American community who had different opinions on how Black Americans should fight for their civil rights. We're also going to see the Civil Rights Act being signed in 1964 and other changes to government legislation, and we're going to try and think about the progress in the civil rights movement generally during this time. There are 5 key areas that I'm going to cover in this video. We're going to begin by looking at the continuation of peaceful protests in the early 1960s, that non-violent direct action that we talked about in the previous video if you've seen it. We're going to move on to look at the growth in popularity of Malcolm X and Black nationalism and how he offered a different voice in the Black American civil rights movement. We're also going to have a look at the relationships in the northern and western cities between the police and Black Americans and how that led to a series of race riots and violence in the street. And then we're also going to have a look at the rise of another group of civil rights activists, the rise of Black Power and the Black Panthers. The final part of the video will take all of these into account to think about the pressure put on the American government and some of the key changes that were made to the law through 3 civil rights acts that were signed in the 1960s. Let's start by looking at the peaceful protests in the early 1960s and the continuation of non-violent direct action. Now, in the previous video, if you haven't seen it, I'd recommend watching it now. We covered 3 key civil rights groups. We looked at the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We looked at SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and we looked at CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. And those groups were generally working together with the same end goal of achieving equality and the civil rights for Black Americans. Now, in May 1961, CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality, organised freedom rides where Black and white protesters challenged bus segregation laws in Alabama, particularly in the city of Birmingham. Now, white and Black protesters rode together on buses that were supposed to be segregated, and these buses were attacked by supporters of segregation, including the KKK. Now, SNCC also got involved, and here's an example of 2 different groups working very, very similar ways. We've got CORE and SNCC both organising similar protests, and this eventually led to President Kennedy asking the governor of Alabama to protect the Freedom Riders. Clearly, these protests were putting pressure on the government, and change was possible. Martin Luther King also continued to be popular in the 1960s, and him and the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, continued to campaign for new laws to protect the rights of Black Americans. In 1963, at the incredibly famous March on Washington, 200,000 Black and 50,000 white Americans marched together. Now, at this march, Martin Luther King gave his incredibly famous I Have a Dream speech, a speech that's very well known today. And in that, he shared his vision for a future for American society, where he called for an American society where Black and white Americans could live side by side in harmony and with equality. This was an example of many, many Black and white people coming together, all with the same end goal of equality. Now, whilst Martin Luther King was still incredibly popular, other voices were beginning to emerge that suggested other ways of protesting for civil rights. Malcolm X became one of the most sought-after speakers in America in the 1960s. Let's have a look at some of his values. Now, during the 1960s, something called Black nationalism gained popularity. Some Black nationalists believed that force was necessary in order to achieve equality. That directly went against Martin Luther King's peaceful protests. Now, other nationalists thought that Black Americans should achieve a better life by living separately to white Americans, that by dividing themselves, separating them away, they could live peacefully on their own. Now, after spending years living in poverty and having some pretty horrific experiences as a child, such as his father being murdered, probably by the KKK, Malcolm X ended up in a life of poverty and crime. He ended up going to prison, and while he was in prison, he converted to Islam and soon joined a group called the Nation of Islam, another of the key groups fighting for the civil rights movement, particularly in the north of America. Now, Malcolm X became an important civil rights campaigner, and he had nationalist views. He wanted to see Black Americans create their own Black state. Malcolm X also had very different opinions to Martin Luther King on how Black Americans should protest to achieve equality and achieve their civil rights. He criticised Martin Luther King's use of peaceful protest and argued that a more violent approach would achieve more progress. He thought that peaceful protest, although it had its place, was holding back Black Americans. It's really important to note at this point, though, that Malcolm X did not just believe in violence. It's a common misconception that Martin Luther King favoured peace, Malcolm X favoured violence. Malcolm X taught that violence should be used when necessary, that if peaceful protest had failed and if negotiation and talking had failed, then violence maybe would push people to make change. Now, in the middle of the 1960s, Malcolm X had a bit of a change of heart. He left the Nation of Islam and he went on a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964. And while he was out in the Middle East, he saw people of all races coming together, and this started to change his nationalist beliefs. He thought that maybe people could live harmoniously from different races in American society. But in 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam. He never really had a chance to put his new ideals and values into practice. Now, in the North and West of America during the 1960s, the relationship between Black American people and the police broke down even further, leading to race riots. Between 1965 and 1967, there were riots in major cities in the North and West of America. And these were cities that suffered from something called ghettoization, where groups of Black people generally lived in isolated and poor areas away from white people. These areas generally saw high levels of poverty and high levels of crime. And of course, white people chose not to live in those areas, which isolated Black people further. Now, the main cause of these riots in the North and West cities was the poor relationship between Black Americans and the police force. Many working class Black Americans didn't trust the mainly white police officers. They felt that they were deliberately targeted and they were brutally treated by the police. And so this level of distrust spilled into violence on the streets. Now, the worst riots took place in an area called Watts, a suburb of Los Angeles in 1965, and in the city of Detroit in 1967. During the Watts riots, 30,000 protesters clashed with the police, leading to 34 deaths. More and more pressure was being put on the government during this time to step in, to intervene, to improve relationships between the police and Black Americans, and to make changes that would help Black Americans access their civil rights. Now, we've covered peaceful protests, we've covered differing voices coming to the front, particularly with Malcolm X and Black nationalism, and then the poor relationship between the police and the Black Americans. We're going to now look at the final key group during this video, and that's the rise of Black Power and the Black Panthers. In 1966, Stokely Carmichael was elected as chairman of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Now, up until this point, they'd worked quite closely with Martin Luther King and with the SCLC, but they started to move away. Carmichael started to use the term Black Power in his speeches, and it led SNCC to more radical methods of protest. Now, a bit like Malcolm X, Carmichael openly criticised Martin Luther King and his vision for an America where white and Black people could live together. Stokely Carmichael accused America of being racist from top to bottom. Now, the Black Panther Party also emerged as part of the Black Power movement, and they were an even more radical organisation than SNCC became. The Black Panthers were a political party, but they're most well known for having a private army of around 2,000 members, and they believed that Black Americans should arm themselves and take their rights by force. Between 1967 and 1969, they clashed many times with the police. Now, of course, the different organisations that were acting during this time and the actions of SNCC and Black Power and people like Malcolm X clearly put pressure on the government for change. But for a lot of white Americans that maybe have been sympathetic to the movement and quite liked Martin Luther King's peaceful protest, they started to maybe change their mind. The growth of the Black Power movement shocked many American people, and so many of these white activists who'd previously supported Black rights turned away from the movement. Now, all of these key events during the 1960s were putting more and more pressure on President Kennedy and then President Johnson's governments. And so there were some changes to the law in America in the 1960s And we'll use those to finish off this question: how did the civil rights movement change? Now, firstly, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed by President Johnson. In the years previous to that, under President Kennedy, he had put forward a civil rights bill. He was going to ask the American government to change the law and to put the Civil Rights Act in place. But in November 1963, he was assassinated, shot dead, and his vice president, President Johnson, then became the President of America. Now, Johnson wanted to honor President Kennedy, and so one of the first things that he did was to put lots of pressure on the government, and the Civil Rights Act was then signed. Now, the 1964 Civil Rights Act made discrimination in employment illegal, but it also said that segregation in schools and all other public areas was now outlawed. So there's some big changes there going on. Now, although clearly discrimination in employment and ending that was a really big goal of the civil rights movement and the protesters, they also wanted to be able to access all of their rights as citizens of America. Now, Martin Luther King and the SCLC continued to put pressure on the government to ensure that Black Americans could access their right to vote. In lots of southern states in America, things were put in place like literacy tests or taxes that stopped Black Americans from voting. In early 1965, Martin Luther King and the SCLC organised a voting rights march in Selma, and 600 protesters were brutally attacked in scenes that were widely broadcast on television and in newspapers on the radio. These scenes shocked people. These scenes were called Bloody Sunday, and if you haven't seen the film Selma that came out just a few years ago, I'd really recommend watching it. But this put more and more pressure on President Johnson, who then signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which made it illegal to do anything that would limit the number of people able to vote. The literacy tests were removed, taxes for voting were also removed, and this act also allowed the government to check in American states that voting was being done properly, that people had their right and their access to votes. Finally, in 1968, 4 years after the Civil Rights Act was signed by President Johnson, he then signs a second Civil Rights Act. Now, this act builds on the first Civil Rights Act of 64, but it extends it to other groups of people as well. It makes it illegal to discriminate against someone buying or renting a house because of their race, their religion, their nationality, or their sex. And so here, the second Civil Rights Act is basically targeting discrimination against anybody in America. Of course, it helps the Black civil rights movement, but it's also helping other minority groups. So there we have it. How did the civil rights movement change in the 1960s? There was continuation of peaceful protests, but there were new voices being raised and different ways of protesting being suggested through Malcolm X and Black Power. Now, it's really important to note that these events put pressure on the government to sign the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s. Before we finish the video, though, I think it's really important to finish the story of Martin Luther King. And on the 3rd of April 1968, he made a very, very famous speech where he talked about his vision of the future and that he dreamt and he'd seen it. And he said, "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as people will get to the promised land." He really believed that American people and American society would eventually get there. But he also knew, as he says in his quote, "I may not get there with you. He may not last." And very interestingly, one day later, Martin Luther King was assassinated, shot dead on the 4th of April 1968. Really important just to recognise the impact that he had, the leadership of the movement, and the impact of other people like Malcolm X, Black nationalism, the rise of Black Power too. Thanks for watching.